The sound of sirens pierced through the quiet suburban street as 3 police cars screeched to a halt in front of 90-year-old Margaret Wilson's pristine Victorian home, all because she refused to hand over her house keys to her neighbor, Karen. Thompson stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching with smug satisfaction as officers approached Margaret's door. She was certain this would finally force the elderly woman to accept her help. But what Karen didn't know was that Margaret wasn't just any grandmother. Behind that silver hair and gentle smile was a former legal secretary with 9 decades of life experience and an iron will that had never been broken. As the officers were about to discover, they weren't responding to a welfare check. They were about to witness a masterclass in standing your ground. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, Margaret Wilson's Victorian home on Maple Street came alive with the gentle sounds of classical music. Not because she needed an alarm. Margaret hadn't used one in decades. Her internal clock, honed over 90 years of disciplined living, was more reliable than any electronic device modern technology could offer. On this particular morning, she moved through her home with the grace and purpose that had become her signature. Her fingers traced the polished mahogany banister as she descended the stairs, each step a testament to the care she'd invested in maintaining her beloved home. The morning light filtered through pristine windows, casting warm patterns across hardwood floors that gleamed from their weekly waxing, a task she still performed herself, much to the concern of well-meaning but misguided neighbors. In the kitchen, Margaret's routine unfolded like a well-rehearsed dance. She measured coffee beans into her grinder, the aroma of fresh grounds mixing with the scent of blooming gardenias from her windowsill garden. Her hands, though marked with age, moved with steady precision as she prepared her breakfast: 2 eggs, whole-grain toast, and a small bowl of fresh berries. The same breakfast she'd enjoyed for the past 30 years. The wall beside her breakfast nook told Margaret's story better than any biography could. Diplomas and certificates from her 45 years as a legal secretary hung alongside family photos and community service awards. Each frame represented a chapter in her life, from her early days working at Johnston & Murray law firm to her retirement celebration, where she'd received special recognition for her contributions to local pro bono work. Margaret's phone chirped with its daily reminders, medication schedule, weekly meal plan, and today's tasks. She'd embraced technology with the same determination. She'd approached everything else in life. Her iPad sat on the counter, open to her banking app, where she meticulously managed her finances. Next to it lay her day planner, because Margaret believed in having both digital and paper backups, a habit from her legal secretary days that had served her well. Outside, her garden flourished under her careful attention. Roses climbed trellises. She'd installed herself last spring. Despite offers of help from the neighborhood handyman, the lawn, trimmed to perfect height, showcased her ability to handle the self-propelled mower she'd specifically chosen for its manageable weight and easy controls. Every aspect of her property reflected the same message. Margaret Wilson was more than capable of caring for herself and her home. The community had long respected Margaret's independence. She'd earned it through decades of contribution, organizing neighborhood watch programs, serving on the library board, and offering free legal document review to seniors who couldn't afford professional services. Her mind remained sharp as ever, enhanced by daily crossword puzzles and her ongoing participation in the local book club she'd founded 15 years ago. Years of experience had taught Margaret that independence wasn't just about physical capability, it was about adaptation and wisdom. When tasks became more challenging, she didn't surrender them. She found smarter ways to accomplish them. Her kitchen had been thoughtfully reorganized to keep everything within easy reach. Her garden tools were selected for ergonomic comfort. Even her clothing choices reflected this philosophy, with carefully chosen pieces that combined practicality with the elegance she'd always prized. As she settled into her morning routine, Margaret reflected on how her home had become both her sanctuary and her statement to the world. Every creak in the floorboards, every blooming flower in her garden, every perfectly organized drawer in her kitchen testified to her ongoing capability. She'd raised 3 children here, nursed her late husband through his final years, and now, in her 9th decade, she continued to thrive independently within these beloved walls. Little did she know that this particular morning marked the beginning of a challenge to everything she'd built, a challenge that would test not just her independence, but the very principles she'd lived by for 90 years. Karen Thompson's arrival on Maple Street came with the subtlety of a marching band. Her moving truck blocked the street for an entire Saturday morning, while an army of workers shuttled designer furniture into the modernized craftsman next door. To Margaret's Victorian. From her kitchen window, Margaret watched as Karen orchestrated the move with the precision of a military commander. Her designer athleisure wore a stark contrast to the working clothes of her moving crew. Within days, Karen had already made her presence known throughout the neighborhood. She arrived at every doorstep with gift baskets containing organic tea, gluten-free cookies, and pamphlets about the importance of community involvement, along with business cards identifying her as a lifestyle optimization consultant. Her smile never quite reached her eyes as she detailed her previous neighborhood's transformation under her guidance. "You should have seen what we accomplished," Karen told anyone who would listen. "We standardized all the mailboxes, implemented a strict color palette for exterior paint, and even established mandatory garden maintenance schedules." She'd pause here, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Some people resisted at first, but they all came around eventually. Change is hard for some people to accept. Margaret received her visit on a Wednesday afternoon. Karen appeared on her porch clutching a gift basket and wearing what she probably thought was an appropriately sympathetic expression. "Mrs. Wilson, I've heard so much about you from everyone. Such an inspiration, managing all alone at your age. I just knew I had to come meet you personally." The conversation that followed was an exercise in diplomatic restraint on Margaret's part. Karen's endless stream of helpful suggestions came wrapped in paper-thin concern. "You know, my mother is about your age, well, maybe a few years younger, and we finally convinced her to move into a lovely assisted living community. She was resistant at first, but now she's thriving with proper supervision." Margaret's response was polite but firm. "How wonderful for your mother. I'm quite content with my current arrangements, but I appreciate your concern." She didn't miss the flash of annoyance that crossed Karen's face at the gentle rebuff. Over the next few weeks, Karen's presence in the neighborhood grew more pronounced. She established herself as the self-appointed coordinator of everything, from lawn care schedules to trash bin placement. Her suggestions came with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety. Those who didn't immediately comply often found themselves the subjects of pointed discussions at her hastily organized neighborhood committee meetings. Margaret observed it all with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades reading between the lines of legal documents. She noticed how Karen's influence spread like ivy, seemingly decorative, but gradually becoming more invasive. The younger families began to fall in line first, worn down by Karen's persistent, friendly reminders about their children's toys being visible in front yards or their garbage bins being left out too long. The breaking point for many came during Karen's first official neighborhood association meeting held in her expansive backyard. She unveiled her vision for a better Maple Street, complete with PowerPoint presentations and 3-ring binders outlining proposed regulations for everything from holiday decorations to the acceptable height of grass. Margaret sat quietly through the presentation, noting how Karen's gaze repeatedly drifted to her home's Victorian architecture, clearly not fitting into the proposed cohesive neighborhood aesthetic. When Karen announced her plans to assist our elderly neighbors with property maintenance decisions, Margaret simply smiled and sipped her tea. already recognizing the storm brewing on her horizon. That evening, as Margaret prepared for bed, she noticed Karen standing in her yard, phone in hand, apparently photographing Margaret's house. Their eyes met through the window, and Karen offered a wave that seemed more warning than greeting. Margaret returned it with the same serene smile she'd perfected during decades of dealing with difficult law partners. Little did Karen know, she wasn't the first person to mistake Margaret's genteel manner for weakness, nor would she be the last to learn the costly lesson of underestimating a woman who'd spent 90 years perfecting the art of standing her ground. The first real clash between Margaret and Karen occurred on an unseasonably warm autumn morning. Margaret was tending to her prized roses, wearing her favorite gardening hat and well-worn gloves, when Karen's shadow fell across her flower bed. "Margaret, dear, you really shouldn't be out in this heat at your age," Karen called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that felt more like a reprimand. "I've noticed you struggling with these gardens lately. My landscaper would be happy to take this burden off your hands." Margaret straightened up slowly, not from weakness, but to compose her response. "That's thoughtful of you, Karen, but my roses and I have an understanding. They bloom for me, and I tend to them myself." She gestured to the pristine flower beds that had won the local garden club's awards 3 years running. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've been meaning to talk to you about the garden club. Several of us feel it might be time for new leadership, someone with more modern ideas about sustainable landscaping." The emphasis on modern hung in the air like a challenge. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood became a battlefield of passive-aggressive skirmishes. Karen began hosting her committee meetings during the exact hours Margaret traditionally worked in her front garden. The gatherings would inevitably migrate to Karen's front porch, where discussions about property values and neighborhood aesthetics would grow suspiciously louder whenever Margaret was within earshot. Margaret found her mail increasingly stuffed with pamphlets about retirement communities and aging-in-place modifications. Each one came with a handwritten note from Karen, always signed with a heart and filled with suggestions that felt more like ultimatums. The situation escalated when Karen organized a neighborhood safety workshop. She had invited a contractor who specialized in home modifications for the elderly, and somehow Margaret's house had become the prime example in his presentation, complete with photos Karen had taken without permission. "As you can see," Karen announced to the gathered neighbors, pointing to a projected image of Margaret's front steps, "these historic features may have charm, but they're accidents waiting to happen. Our older residents need our help whether they realize it or not." Margaret sat through the presentation with the same composed expression she'd worn through countless contentious legal negotiations. When Karen called for questions, Margaret's hand rose with elegant precision. "I appreciate your concern for safety," Margaret began, her voice carrying the weight of 90 years of lived experience. "However, I should point out that taking and displaying photos of private property without consent could be considered a violation of privacy laws. I'd be happy to share some relevant legal precedents from my years at the law firm." The room fell silent. Karen's face flushed as she quickly changed the slide, but the damage was done. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly very interested in their phones or the ceiling. The following day, Margaret found a typed letter in her mailbox. Karen had regretfully removed her from the garden club email list, citing concerns about the stress of organizing activities. The letter was copied to several neighborhood board members, an obvious attempt to formalize what had been, until then, a personal vendetta. That evening, as Margaret sat in her study, reviewing the letter, she heard Karen's voice drifting through her open window. She was on her phone, pacing in her backyard. "You should see how she lives all alone in that huge house," Karen was saying. "It's not safe. Someone needs to step in before something terrible happens. Yes, I've tried being nice. No, she won't listen to reason. There has to be something we can do." Margaret carefully folded the letter and placed it in a new file folder labeled Neighborhood Correspondence. Beneath her calm exterior, decades of professional experience were already forming a strategy. She'd faced down ambitious junior partners and aggressive opposing counsel in her time. A pushy neighbor with a savior complex was nothing new. What Karen had yet to learn was that Margaret's pleasant demeanor masked a spine of steel and a mind that had spent nearly half a century navigating the intricacies of legal warfare. The question wasn't if Karen would learn this lesson, but how many others would witness her education. The morning that changed everything on Maple Street began like any other. Margaret was enjoying her morning coffee when the sharp, insistent rapping of knuckles against her front door broke the peaceful silence. Through the etched glass panels, she could make out Karen's distinct silhouette, accompanied by two other figures she recognized from the neighborhood committee. "Margaret! Margaret, we know you're in there. We can see your kitchen light on." Karen's voice carried the false sweetness that had become her trademark. "We need to discuss something important." With deliberate calm, Margaret set down her coffee cup, straightened her cardigan, and made her way to the door. She opened it exactly wide enough for polite conversation, but not enough to constitute an invitation inside. "Good morning, Karen. Susan. Robert." She acknowledged each visitor with a slight nod. "What brings you by so early?" Karen thrust forward a document folder embossed with the Neighborhood Association logo. "We've been reviewing the new safety protocols we discussed at last week's meeting. As the committee's appointed safety coordinator, I've prepared some documents for you to sign." Margaret accepted the folder but didn't open it. "How thoughtful. And what exactly am I being asked to sign?" "It's quite simple, really." Karen's smile tightened. "Given recent concerns about the welfare of our elderly residents, we're implementing a buddy system. Each senior homeowner will provide a spare key to their designated neighborhood safety coordinator. That's me, for emergency purposes only, of course." The morning sun caught the edge of Karen's oversized designer watch as she reached into her bag and produced a brand new keyring. "I've already taken the liberty of having a locksmith prepare a set of keys. All you need to do is sign the authorization form, and we can implement these safety measures immediately." Margaret's expression remained perfectly neutral, though her grip on the folder tightened slightly. "I see. And this locksmith, did they use existing keys to make these copies?" Karen's confidence faltered for a fraction of a second. "Well, no. But the association has certain rights when it comes to safety measures. Rights that don't supersede state property laws or personal privacy rights," Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades in legal offices. "Making unauthorized copies of house keys without the owner's consent could be considered a criminal offense in this state." Susan and Robert exchanged uncomfortable glances. This clearly wasn't going according to Karen's script. "Now, see here." Karen's voice rose, her facade of concern cracking. "This isn't about legal technicalities. This is about your safety. Just last week you were out in the garden for hours in the hot sun. What if you had fallen? What if you had heat stroke? Who would have helped you? The same people who have always helped me. Those I choose to trust with my spare keys. My daughter in the city, my grandson across town, and Mrs. Chen next door, who has been my friend for 30 years. Margaret's voice remained steady. "I appreciate your concern, Karen, but my independence is not up for committee vote." Karen's face flushed red. "This isn't about independence. This is about an elderly woman being too stubborn to accept help, too proud to admit she can't manage alone anymore. Do you think we don't see you struggling with those stairs? Those heavy gardening tools?" "Karen." Margaret's tone carried a warning that made even Susan and Robert step back. "I suggest you take a moment to consider your next words very carefully." But Karen was past caring about careful words. Months of frustrated attempts to control the situation, to bend Margaret to her will, erupted in a torrent of self-righteous indignation. "No, you need to listen. I've dealt with stubborn seniors before. My own mother was just like you, convinced she could manage everything herself until she fell and broke her hip. Well, I won't have that on my conscience, not again. Either you sign these papers and hand over those keys, or I'll be forced to take more serious action." Margaret's response was to carefully close the folder and extend it back to Karen. "I believe we're done here." "Oh, we're far from done." Karen snatched the folder back. "If you won't accept help voluntarily, then I'll have to call people who can make you see reason. I have contacts in social services. One call about a possibly incompetent elderly resident, and they'll have to investigate. Are you threatening me, Karen?" Margaret's voice was soft, but carried to the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the commotion. "I'm trying to help you." Karen's voice had risen to a shout. "Why won't you just let me help you?" Fine. You want to do this the hard way. I'm calling the authorities right now. Let's see how independent you feel when Adult Protective Services shows up." Karen pulled out her phone and, with shaking fingers, began to dial. Susan tried to place a restraining hand on her arm, but Karen shrugged it off. "Yes, hello. I need to report a welfare concern. There's an elderly woman, 90 years old, living alone, refusing assistance, possibly not competent to make her own decisions." Karen's voice carried across the now silent street as she paced on Margaret's front porch. Margaret stood in her doorway, straight-backed and composed, watching as Karen's actions set in motion events that would change their quiet neighborhood forever. Behind her perfect posture and serene expression, her mind was already cataloguing witnesses, mentally drafting statements, and preparing for the battle ahead. The sound of approaching sirens split the morning air, and Margaret allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Karen had just made a serious tactical error, and she was about to learn why picking a fight with a former legal secretary might have been the biggest mistake of her amateur career as a neighborhood dictator. The 3 police cars pulled up to Margaret's Victorian home with unnecessary urgency, their lights casting rotating blue patterns across the growing crowd of neighbors. Officer James Chen, a veteran of the force with 20 years of experience, stepped out first, immediately assessing the peculiar scene before him. On one side stood an elderly woman in an impeccable cardigan, looking more like she was about to host a tea party than someone in need of emergency intervention. On the other, a younger woman in designer athleisure wear was gesturing animatedly, her face flushed with righteous indignation. "She's refusing help!" Karen rushed toward the officers before they could even approach the house. "She's 90 years old, living alone, and she won't accept any assistance. She's a danger to herself." Officer Chen held up a calming hand. "Ma'am, please step back and let us assess the situation." He turned to his partner, Officer Sarah Rodriguez, and nodded toward Margaret. "Would you mind if we spoke with you, ma'am?" Margaret's smile was gracious. "Of course, officers. Would you like to come inside? I just made a fresh pot of coffee, and I have all my medical and legal documentation readily available in my study." The bureau officers exchanged glances, already sensing this call wasn't quite what dispatch had described. As they followed Margaret into her home, Karen tried to push her way in behind them. "I should be present for this. I'm the one who—" "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez's tone was firm. "Please wait outside. We need to conduct our welfare check without interference." Inside, Margaret's home told its own story. The officers found themselves in an immaculately kept Victorian interior, where every surface gleamed and family photos shared space with community service awards. Margaret led them to her study, a room that would have looked at home in any professional law office. "I keep everything organized," she explained, pulling out a neatly labeled folder. "Here are my recent medical records, documentation of my regular checkups, and my lawyer's contact information. I also maintain a daily log of my activities and medications, if you'd like to review that." Officer Chen accepted the folder, impressed by its meticulous organization. "Mrs. Wilson, I apologize for the disruption. It's clear you're very thorough in managing your affairs." "Oh, don't apologize, Officer Chen. You're just doing your job." Margaret settled into her leather desk chair with the ease of someone who'd spent decades in similar seats. Though I would like to file a report about harassment and attempted unauthorized entry to my property, I believe having a record of today's events might be prudent. Outside, Karen was pacing the sidewalk, her audience of neighbors growing increasingly uncomfortable with her running commentary about stubborn old people and necessary interventions. The arrival of a sleek town car drew everyone's attention. Distinguished-looking man in his 60s emerged, carrying a leather briefcase. "I'm Richard Johnston, Mrs. Wilson's attorney," he announced, making his way through the crowd. "I received her text message about this situation." When the officers emerged from Margaret's home 30 minutes later, their expressions were professionally neutral, but their body language told the story. Officer Rodriguez was already on her radio, cancelling the call for adult protective services. "Mrs. Thompson," Officer Chen addressed Karen directly. "We found no cause for concern regarding Mrs. Wilson's welfare. In fact, she's one of the most organized and self-sufficient residents we've encountered. However," he paused, consulting his notepad, "we do need to discuss the matter of unauthorized attempts to copy house keys and potential harassment charges." The color drained from Karen's face as she watched her carefully constructed narrative crumble. The neighbors who had gathered to witness the drama began to disperse, many shooting disapproving looks in her direction. Margaret stood in her doorway, her attorney at her side, the picture of composed dignity. "Remember, Karen," Margaret called, out softly, her voice carrying across the now quiet street. "I spent 45 years handling legal documentation. Next time you decide to report someone to authorities, you might want to check their background first." As the police cars departed and the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet, it was clear that the battle lines had been drawn. Karen had made her move, but Margaret had decades of experience in handling such challenges. The real question now was, what would happen next? The morning after the police incident, Margaret's study transformed into a war room of sorts. She sat at her antique desk, surrounded by meticulously organized documents, while her attorney, Richard Johnston, reviewed her carefully compiled evidence from the past few months. "I have to admit, Margaret, you haven't lost your touch," Richard said, examining the chronological log of Karen's interventions. "Most people would have just complained to their families. You've documented everything like you're preparing for a Supreme Court case." Margaret adjusted her reading glasses as she sorted through another folder. 45 years of legal work teaches you to keep receipts, Richard. Every email, every pamphlet, every friendly suggestion she's left in my mailbox. Even recordings of her neighborhood meetings, since she insisted on holding them right outside my window. Richard picked up a particularly thick folder labeled Property Rights Violations. Inside were photographs of Karen taking pictures of Margaret's house, detailed accounts of her attempts to access the property, and statements from neighbors who'd witnessed various confrontations. "The unauthorized key-copying attempt is particularly interesting," Richard mused, making notes in his legal pad. "Combined with the witnessed threats and false report to authorities, we have grounds for several legal actions." Margaret sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I'm not looking to destroy her, Richard. I just want to establish clear boundaries. Sometimes people need a formal reminder of where their authority ends and others' rights begin." Their discussion was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Through the window, they could see a woman in a business suit, holding what appeared to be official documents. "Right on schedule," Margaret remarked, checking her watch. "Karen's quite predictable when she's backed into a corner." The woman at the door introduced herself as Patricia Morrison, representing the neighborhood association's legal interests. Margaret invited her into the study, where Richard was waiting with a professionally neutral expression. "Mrs. Wilson," Patricia began, placing a thick document folder on the desk, "the association has some concerns about recent events. We have a responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of all our residents." "How fascinating," Margaret replied, opening her own folder. I have some concerns as well. Shall we discuss the 16 documented instances of harassment, the unauthorized photography of private property, or the attempted illegal duplication of house keys first? Patricia's confident demeanor faltered slightly. We're simply trying to implement standard safety protocols. Without proper authority or legal standing, Richard interjected smoothly. I've reviewed your association's bylaws thoroughly. There's nothing in them that allows for compulsory key surrender or warrantless property inspections. Margaret leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience. Furthermore, any attempt to force compliance through intimidation or false reports to authorities could be construed as elder abuse under state law. I'm sure that's not the kind of publicity your association is seeking. The meeting continued for another hour, with Patricia's aggressive stance gradually giving way to a more conciliatory approach. By the time she left, carrying significantly more documents than she'd arrived with, the power dynamic had shifted noticeably. Well played, Richard commented after Patricia's departure. You let her walk in thinking she had the upper hand, then systematically dismantled every possible legal argument. Margaret began organizing the meeting notes into a new folder. Karen will try something else, of course. People like her always do. But now we've established a legal precedent for any future incidents. As if on cue, Margaret's phone buzzed with text messages from neighbors. Karen was apparently calling an emergency association meeting for that evening. The agenda: discussing recent disruptions to neighborhood harmony. Should we prepare for the meeting? Richard asked, reaching for his briefcase. Margaret smiled, the same smile that had unsettled countless opposing counsels over the years. Oh, I'm already prepared. Karen seems to have forgotten that I spent decades taking minutes at board meetings. I know exactly how to handle this particular type of procedural warfare. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing. The neighborhood association was about to learn why generations of lawyers had relied on Margaret Wilson to keep their offices running smoothly. Sometimes the most effective legal maneuvers weren't about dramatic courtroom showdowns. They were about knowing exactly how to work within the system to achieve the desired results. The Emergency Neighborhood Association meeting was held in the community center, a modest building that had hosted everything from bake sales to wedding receptions over the years. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was anything but festive. The usual friendly chatter was replaced by tense whispers as neighbors chose their seats carefully, creating an invisible but palpable divide in the room. Karen stood at the podium, her designer outfit and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to the casual attire of most residents. Behind her, a PowerPoint presentation displayed the title, Maintaining Community Standards, a Discussion of Recent Events. As your duly appointed safety coordinator, Karen began, her voice carrying that familiar note of manufactured concern, I feel compelled to address the unfortunate incidents that have recently disrupted our peaceful community. In the third row, Margaret sat with perfect posture, her legal pad balanced on her knee. Beside her was Mrs. Chen, her neighbor of 30 years, who had brought her famous lemon cookies, a quiet act of solidarity. While some may view our safety protocols as intrusive, Karen continued, glancing pointedly in Margaret's direction, we must consider the greater good. What happens when one resident's stubbornness puts others at risk? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several of the older residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Rodriguez, a 78-year-old retired teacher, clutched her house keys protectively. Margaret's hand rose with elegant precision. Point of order, she called out, her voice clear and steady. According to the association bylaws, Section 3, Paragraph 2, emergency meetings require documentation of the specific emergency and must be announced with a minimum of 48 hours notice, except in cases of immediate safety threats. She consulted her notes. As no such documentation was provided and no immediate threat exists, this meeting is technically unofficial and no binding votes can be taken. The room erupted in whispered conversations. Karen's face flushed as she shuffled through her papers, clearly caught off guard by the procedural challenge. That is, Karen stumbled, then rallied. This just proves my point about resistance to necessary changes. We have seniors in this community who are clearly too set in their ways to accept help. Excuse me, a new voice spoke up. It was Tom Franklin, whose mother lived in assisted living across town. I work in healthcare, and I have to say, forcing someone to give up their independence without cause isn't help, it's harassment. Exactly, called out Susan Phillips, one of Karen's former allies. My grandmother lived independently until she was 95. Age isn't a crime. Karen's supporters tried to regain control of the narrative. But what about property values? Someone called out. Non-standard maintenance could affect all our homes. Margaret stood slowly, commanding attention without raising her voice. I have here the property value assessments for our neighborhood over the past 30 years. She held up a detailed chart. The Victorian homes, including mine, have consistently appreciated at a rate 15% higher than the newer constructions. I'd be happy to share the data. The meeting devolved into multiple heated discussions. Younger families who had initially supported Karen's modernization plans were now speaking up about their own parents and grandparents. Older residents, emboldened by Margaret's stand, shared stories of subtle pressures they'd faced to conform to Karen's standards. Mrs. Chen stood up, her quiet voice somehow cutting through the chaos. I have lived here for 30 years, Margaret. Helped my children with their college applications, taught me to navigate the American legal system when I first arrived. She is not just independent, she helps others be independent too. As the meeting continued to unravel, Karen made a final, desperate attempt to regain control. This is exactly why we need standardized protocols. Without proper oversight, point of order, Margaret interrupted again. As this meeting has been ruled unofficial, no protocols can be established or enforced. Furthermore, any attempts to implement unauthorized restrictions could result in civil action for discrimination based on age. The meeting ended not with a vote, but with a quiet exodus. Neighbors gathered in small groups, discussing the evening's events. Several stopped to shake Margaret's hand or share a supportive word. Even some who had initially supported Karen's initiatives were reconsidering their positions. Walking home under the evening sky, Margaret and Mrs. Chen observed the changes already taking place in their community. Lights were on in various houses, and through windows they could see neighbors engaged in animated discussions. You've started something, Mrs. Chen remarked, adjusting her cookie container under her arm. Margaret smiled, thinking of the many legal battles she'd witnessed over the years. No, dear, I simply reminded everyone that standing up for oneself isn't about age. It's about dignity. And that's something worth protecting at any age. After the failed neighborhood meeting, Karen's tactics shifted from overt confrontation to something more insidious. It began with anonymous calls to various authorities: health department, building inspection, code enforcement, each visit prompted by concerned citizen reports about Margaret's property. Margaret handled each inspection with gracious efficiency, producing permits, maintenance records, and documentation before the officials could even ask for them. Her home passed every inspection with flying colors, leaving frustrated inspectors apologizing for the unnecessary visits. Third time this week, Margaret remarked to Mrs. Chen as they watched yet another official car drive away. At least this one was apologetic about the wild claim that I'm running an illegal business from my home. Mrs. Chen shook her head, offering Margaret a fresh cup of tea. Karen was watching from her window the whole time. She looked quite angry when the inspector smiled and shook your hand. The escalation continued. Anonymous letters began appearing in other neighbors' mailboxes, expressing community concerns about the risks of allowing elderly residents to live without supervision. Each letter cited tragic news stories about seniors living alone, carefully selected to stoke fears and doubt. Margaret discovered this latest tactic when Mr. Peterson, a kindly widower from 2 streets over, brought her one of the letters. His hands shook as he handed it to her. "They're saying we're a burden, Margaret, that we're putting everyone at risk just by trying to live in our own homes." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd already fought too many battles to maintain. His independence. Margaret carefully added the letter to her growing evidence file. "Don't worry, George. These scare tactics only work if we let them." She poured him a cup of coffee and added 2 sugars, just as he liked it. "Remember when they tried to force you to remove your workshop last year? Who helped you file the permit? Paperwork?" "You did," he smiled, his confidence returning slightly. "Karen's not the first person to think she knows better than us, is she?" But Karen wasn't finished. The next escalation came in the form of a social services investigation, prompted by multiple anonymous reports about Margaret's mental competency. The young social worker who arrived, Lisa Martinez, found herself sitting in Margaret's immaculate study, surrounded by evidence of a life lived with exceptional organization and clarity. "Mrs. Wilson," Lisa began, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, "we have to investigate all reports, but I can already see that the reports are unfounded," Margaret finished gently, sliding across her most recent medical evaluations. "I understand you're doing your job, dear. Would you like to see my daily activity logs as well? Or perhaps the security camera footage showing who's been filing these reports?" Lisa's eyebrows rose. "You have security cameras? Installed last month, after the suspicious activity around my property began. My grandson works in cybersecurity. He made sure everything was properly documented and legally compliant." As Lisa left, notebook filled with observations that would effectively end any further investigations, Karen's car pulled into her driveway. The 2 women passed each other on the sidewalk, Karen's face darkening at the social worker's friendly wave to Margaret. That evening, Margaret sat in her study, reviewing her options. The stack of documented incidents had grown substantially, each failed attempt at intervention only adding to her case. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard, her attorney. "Ready to proceed when you are." Margaret's response was typically measured. "Not yet. Let's see what she does next." She didn't have to wait long. The next morning, a large envelope arrived from the Neighborhood Association's newly retained law firm. Inside was a formal notice of intent to amend the association's bylaws, specifically targeting high-risk residents with new restrictions and requirements. Margaret allowed herself a small smile as she read the document. Karen had finally made the mistake she'd been waiting for, attempting to codify discrimination into the neighborhood's legal framework. As she reached for her phone to call Richard, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the window. Behind her, photographs of her legal career lined the wall. 4 decades of watching powerful people underestimate her, of quietly building cases while others rushed to judgment. Karen wasn't the first person to mistake patience for weakness, and she probably wouldn't be the last. The question now wasn't whether Margaret would respond, but how many others would benefit when she did. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter and a popular local lifestyle blogger, published a post titled "Age Discrimination in the Digital Age, When Help Becomes Harassment." Without naming names, she detailed the ongoing situation in her grandmother's neighborhood, complete with carefully redacted copies of the anonymous letters and proposed bylaw changes. The post went viral within hours. Local Facebook groups buzzed with activity as residents from surrounding neighborhoods recognized the situation. Comments poured in from adult children worried about their own aging parents, seniors sharing similar experiences, and community activists concerned about the broader implications. "Have you seen this?" Mrs. Chen asked, showing Margaret her phone during their morning tea. The original blog post had been shared thousands of times, spawning heated discussions across multiple social media platforms. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses to look at the screen. Interesting, though I suspect Karen won't appreciate being referred to as an overzealous neighbor with a savior complex. She was right. Karen's reaction to the sudden public attention was swift and defensive. She created her own social media posts, presenting herself as a concerned citizen trying to protect vulnerable residents from themselves. Her carefully worded statement about community safety initiatives might have been convincing if Sarah hadn't immediately followed up with a video compilation of security camera footage showing Karen's various unauthorized property inspections. The local news caught wind of the story by Wednesday. A young reporter from Channel 5, Emily Watson, appeared on Margaret's doorstep with a cameraman in tow. "Mrs. Wilson, we're doing a story on senior rights and community governance. Would you be willing to share your perspective?" Margaret regarded the eager journalist thoughtfully. "Why don't you come in, dear? I have some documentation you might find interesting." The resulting news segment was a masterpiece of understated revelation. Margaret, elegant and articulate, spoke not about her own situation, but about the broader issues facing seniors who wished to maintain their independence. She cited statistics, legal precedents, and specific examples of age discrimination masquerading as concern. "The question isn't about age," she told Emily, her voice carrying the weight of 90 years of wisdom. "It's about dignity and self-determination. When does helping become controlling? When does concern become coercion?" The story spread to other news outlets, online forums filled with debates about senior rights and community oversight. Legal experts weighed in on the implications of forced compliance with unauthorized safety protocols. Senior advocacy groups began citing the situation as an example of subtle discrimination. Karen's attempts to control the narrative backfired spectacularly. Her appearance on a rival news channel, where she tearfully described her mission to protect vulnerable seniors, was immediately contrasted with security footage of her attempting to photograph through Margaret's windows. By Friday, the story had attracted national attention. Margaret's phone rang constantly with interview requests from major networks and newspapers. She declined them all politely, directing inquiries to senior advocacy organizations instead. "But don't you want to tell your side?" Mrs. Chen asked, watching another news van drive slowly past their houses. Margaret smiled, sorting through her morning mail. "My dear, sometimes the most effective statement is letting others recognize themselves in your situation. How many families are having important conversations about senior independence because of this? How many other neighborhoods are reconsidering their policies?" The mail included more letters of support than she could read in one sitting. Senior groups offered legal assistance. Law firms specializing in civil rights expressed interest in the case. Community organizations requested her input on developing fair housing policies. Karen, meanwhile, had gone suspiciously quiet. Her normally active social media accounts fell silent. Her car left early each morning and returned late at night, avoiding the news vans that occasionally parked on their street. "She's planning something," Mrs. Chen observed, watching Karen's dark house one evening. "Of course she is," Margaret replied, calmly sipping her tea. People like Karen don't adjust their worldview easily. When public opinion turns against them, they often become more determined to prove themselves right. As if to prove her point, a new certified letter arrived the next morning. The neighborhood association's lawyers had scheduled an emergency board meeting to discuss recent media misrepresentations and necessary security measures. Margaret filed the letter carefully away, adding it to her growing collection of evidence. The public attention had changed the game, but the fundamental conflict remained the same. Karen was still trying to control the narrative. She just had a much larger audience watching her every move. The official investigation began not with a bang, but with a polite knock on Margaret's door. Two representatives from the State Housing Authority arrived early Monday morning, their badges gleaming in the autumn sunlight. Behind them, a small team of experts waited, a geriatric care specialist, a housing inspector, and a civil rights attorney. Mrs. Wilson, the lead investigator, Dr. Amanda Torres, extended her hand. "We're here about the multiple complaints and counter-complaints filed regarding your situation. Would you mind if we conducted a thorough evaluation?" Margaret welcomed them into her home with characteristic grace. "I've prepared a comprehensive information packet for each of you," she said, retrieving precisely organized folders from her study. "You'll find my medical records, property maintenance logs, financial statements, and documented incidents of harassment on the right-hand side of each folder." Dr. Torres blinked at the level of preparation. "This is unusually thorough. 45 years as a legal secretary teaches you the value of good documentation," Margaret replied with a slight smile. "Shall we begin with a house tour? I believe the recent allegations mentioned concerns about maintenance and safety. The inspection that followed was more like a masterclass in home management." Margaret led them through her Victorian home, demonstrating the subtle modifications she'd made to maintain her independence. Motion sensor lights in strategic locations, grip bars elegantly disguised as decorative fixtures, a state-of-the-art security system integrated with her smartphone. "Here's my medication management system," she explained, showing them a perfectly organized cabinet with a digital reminder system. "My doctor reviews it quarterly, though I haven't missed a dose in 15 years. The geriatric specialist, Dr. R. Chen, no relation to her neighbor, was particularly impressed by Margaret's home office setup. "Your organizational systems are remarkable. Many younger people could learn from this." As the team conducted their evaluation, Karen's attempts at intervention became increasingly apparent. The housing inspector discovered multiple false complaints filed about code violations, each one meticulously documented in Margaret's records, along with proof of compliance. "Mrs. Wilson," the civil rights attorney James Martinez called from the study, "these letters from your neighbor. She's been attempting to access your property without permission. The security cameras caught 14 attempts in the past month alone," Margaret confirmed, pulling up the footage on her tablet. "I've documented each incident with time-stamps and witness statements." The investigation extended beyond Margaret's home. Other elderly residents in the neighborhood were interviewed, revealing a pattern of similar pressure tactics. Mr. Peterson shared recordings of Karen's wellness checks that sounded more like interrogations. Mrs. Chen provided emails showing attempted interference with her garden club membership. By afternoon, Dr. Torres was shaking her head in amazement. "Mrs. Wilson, in 20 years of investigating senior welfare cases, I've never seen anyone more capable of managing their independence. Your documentation alone shows a level of competence that, frankly, puts many younger homeowners to shame." The civil rights attorney was more direct. "The evidence suggests a clear pattern of age-based harassment disguised as community concern. Mrs. Wilson, would you be interested in filing a formal discrimination complaint?" Margaret considered this as she served the team coffee from her perfectly organized kitchen. "My goal isn't to punish anyone, Mr. Martinez. I simply want to establish a precedent that protects others in similar situations. Too many seniors give up their independence because they don't know how to fight back against well-meaning tyranny." The final report, compiled over several hours at Margaret's dining room table, was comprehensive. Dr. Torres's conclusion was unequivocal. Not only was Margaret fully capable of independent living, but her home management systems could serve as a model for senior independence programs. As the team prepared to leave, they noticed Karen watching from her window, phone pressed to her ear. The housing inspector sighed. "I suspect we'll be hearing from her lawyers soon." "Oh, undoubtedly," Margaret agreed, walking them to the door. "But now we have an official record of everything. Sometimes the best defense is simply letting the truth speak for itself. After the investigation team departed, Margaret sat in her study, reviewing her copy of their preliminary findings. Each page validated what she'd known all along. Age alone was not a measure of capability. As she filed the report away in her ever-growing documentation, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. Karen's attempts to prove her incompetence had only served to demonstrate just how capable she really was. The real question now was, how would Karen respond when she realized her campaign of concern had backfired so spectacularly? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret was having her weekly coffee with Richard, her attorney, when his junior associate burst into the study, tablet in hand, her face flushed with excitement. "You're not going to believe what I found," Jenny exclaimed, forgetting professional decorum in her enthusiasm. "I was doing that background check you requested on Karen Thompson, but I couldn't find much activity before 5 years ago. So I tried her maiden name, Karen Mitchell, and well, you need to see this." She placed the tablet on Margaret's desk, displaying a series of news articles from different suburban communities across 3 states. The headlines told a disturbing pattern. Local HOA president accused of overreach. Controversial community. Officer resigns amid complaints. Senior rights group questions neighborhood leadership. "She's done this before," Richard said slowly, scrolling through the articles. "Multiple times, in different places." Margaret adjusted her reading glasses, taking in the details. In each community, the pattern was identical. Karen would move and quickly assume a position of authority in the local homeowners association, then begin campaigning for increasingly restrictive safety measures targeting elderly residents. "Look at this one," Jenny pointed to a particular article. 3 years ago, in Riverside Commons, she successfully pushed through mandatory health inspections for residents over 70. Several seniors were forced to move when they couldn't comply with her safety requirements. Richard leaned forward, his legal mind already working, and each time, when the resistance got too strong, she'd simply move to a new community and start over. No one ever connected the dots because she used different names. Karen Mitchell, Karen Thompson Mitchell. "There's more," Jenny continued, pulling up additional documents. "I found court records. Her mother didn't just fall and break her hip, as she claims. She was living independently until Karen tried to force her into assisted living. There was a legal battle. Her mother got a restraining order against her." Margaret sat back in her chair, pieces falling into place. "That's why she's so aggressive about this. She's not just being controlling, she's trying to justify what she did to her own mother." The revelations continued as they dug deeper. Karen's pattern of behavior had left a trail across multiple jurisdictions. Forced renovations, mandatory health checks, attempted conservatorships. She'd refined her tactics with each move, learning to disguise her actions as community concern. "Here's what happened in her last neighborhood," Jenny said, pulling up another article. "She actually managed to get several elderly residents to sign over their healthcare proxy rights to the neighborhood association. It took a class action lawsuit to reverse it, and then she resigned and disappeared before the case was settled." Richard finished, his voice grim. "Started fresh here with us." Margaret stood, walking to her window. From her study, she could see Karen's house, where a cleaning service was meticulously maintaining the perfect lawn she'd mandated for all residents. "She's not just a busybody," Margaret said quietly. "She's systematic about this. Each time she learns from her mistakes, makes her approach more sophisticated. The question is," Richard mused, "what do we do with this information?" Margaret turned back to her desk, her expression thoughtful. "First, we need to verify everything. I want double confirmation on all these incidents. Then we need to contact the previous victims, carefully, discreetly. See if they're willing to go on record." Jenny was already taking notes. "Some of them might be reluctant. There were confidentiality agreements in a few cases. Those agreements might not be enforceable if they were signed under duress, Richard pointed out. And if we can prove a pattern of predatory behavior— No, Margaret interrupted, surprising. Both lawyers. We're not going to use this to attack her. At least, not directly. Richard looked up confused. But this is exactly what we need to stop her. Margaret smiled, the same smile that had unnerved countless opposing counsels over her decades in law offices. We're going to do something much more effective. We're going to give her a chance to stop herself. She pulled out a fresh legal pad. Here's what we're going to do. First, we'll prepare a complete documentation package. All the evidence, all the patterns, all the previous incidents. Everything meticulously organized and verified. And then, Jenny asked, then we'll call a neighborhood meeting, but not just our neighborhood. We'll invite representatives from every community she's targeted. We'll invite her mother. We'll invite senior rights advocates and legal experts. We'll make it impossible for her to control the narrative. Richard leaned back, understanding dawning. You're not looking to punish her. You're looking to expose the pattern so thoroughly that she can't just move on and start over somewhere else. Exactly, Margaret nodded. Sometimes the most effective way to stop harmful behavior is to shine a light so bright that there's nowhere left to hide. As they worked late into the evening, preparing documentation and making discreet contacts, Margaret couldn't help but feel a certain sadness. Karen's crusade against elderly independence clearly stemmed from her own unresolved trauma with her mother. But good intentions didn't justify harmful actions, and sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was to firmly stop them from hurting others. The real question was, how would Karen react when she realized her entire history was about to be exposed? Margaret had a feeling they would find out very soon. Operation Truth, as Mrs. Chen had dubbed it, transformed Margaret's study into a command center. Every surface held carefully organized documents, each telling part of Karen's decade-long campaign against senior independence. Phone calls came, irregularly from previous communities, adding new pieces to the puzzle. Another one from Riverside Commons, Jenny announced, adding a note to their growing timeline. The former HOA treasurer confirms Karen tried to implement mandatory health inspections for anyone over 65. She claimed it was for insurance purposes. Margaret nodded, updating her master document. Add it to the pattern analysis. That's the third time she's used insurance requirements as leverage. She turned to Richard, who was reviewing statements from Karen's previous neighborhoods. Any word from her mother? Better than that, Richard replied, holding up a thick manila envelope. Her mother's attorney sent over the complete case file from their legal battle, including Karen's psychological evaluation. The evaluation painted a complex picture. Karen's obsession with controlling elderly residents stemmed from genuine trauma, watching her grandmother decline rapidly after refusing help. But her response had become pathological, a compulsive need to prevent anyone from making the same mistake. Look at this. Mrs. Chen called from her station at Margaret's laptop, where she was analyzing Karen's social media history. She uses the same phrases in every community: necessary intervention, protective oversight, responsible community management. It's like a script. Margaret studied the pattern board they'd created. Red strings connected similar incidents across different neighborhoods, showing the evolution of Karen's tactics. Each move brought more sophisticated methods of control, better legal coverage, stronger manipulation of community guidelines. She learns from every failure, Margaret observed. See how she shifted from direct demands to procedural changes. After the restraining order from her mother, she stopped confronting people personally, started working through committees and regulations instead. The evidence was overwhelming, but Margaret insisted on verification for every detail. Each incident needed at least 2 independent confirmations. Every document had to be authenticated. She wouldn't risk Karen finding a single hole in their case. Mrs. Reynolds from Oakwood Heights is willing to testify, Jenny reported, ending another call. She says Karen tried to force her to add the HOA as a healthcare proxy. When she refused, suddenly there were daily complaints about her property maintenance. They worked methodically, building a timeline that spanned 10 years and 5 communities. Karen's pattern became clearer with each new piece of evidence. She would arrive in a neighborhood, establish herself as a concerned community leader, then gradually implement increasingly restrictive policies targeting senior residents. "What I don't understand," Mrs. Chen said during a coffee break, "is why no one stopped her sooner." "Because she's careful," Margaret explained. "She never stays long enough for the full impact to become apparent. By the time people realize what's happening, she's already moved on to her next target." Richard added another document to their legal filing. "And she's smart about it. Always operates within technical legal boundaries, even if she's violating the spirit of the law. That's why we need to show the entire pattern, not just individual incidents." Margaret stood at her evidence board, studying the web of connections they'd uncovered. "It's not about winning a legal battle," she said quietly. "It's about making it impossible for her to simply start over somewhere else. We need to break the cycle." As evening approached, the team reviewed their assembled case. They had statements from former neighbors, documented evidence of systematic harassment, psychological evaluations, and a clear pattern of escalating control tactics. But Margaret insisted on one final step. "We need to offer her a way out," she announced, surprising the others. "Before we take this public, we give her a chance to address this herself." "You think she'll actually listen?" Jenny asked skeptically. Margaret smiled, the wisdom of 90 years reflected in her eyes. "Sometimes people need to see their whole pattern laid out before they can recognize what they've become. We'll present her with 2 options. She can face public exposure of everything we've uncovered, or she can agree to counseling and make amends to those she's harmed." As they prepared the final documentation, Margaret couldn't help but wonder which path Karen would choose. The confrontation was coming, but its outcome would depend on whether Karen could finally face the truth about herself. The evening they chose to confront Karen was unseasonably cool for autumn. Margaret's living room, usually a place of warmth and comfort, had been transformed into an informal conference room. Richard and Jenny sat on one side of the antique coffee table, while Mrs. Chen busied herself arranging cookies that no one would likely eat. At precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Margaret opened it to find Karen standing there, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Her usual confident demeanor faltered slightly at the sight of the assembled group. "What's this about?" Karen demanded, though she made no move to enter. "If this is some kind of ambush, this is an opportunity," Margaret replied calmly. "Please come in. There are some things we need to discuss." Karen's eyes darted around the room, taking in the carefully arranged documents on the coffee table, the formal presence of the lawyers, the unusually serious expression on Mrs. Chen's face. For a moment, it seemed she might flee. Instead, she squared her shoulders and stepped inside. "If this is about the new community guidelines, I've already consulted with our attorneys. Everything we're proposing is perfectly legal. We're not here to discuss the current guidelines," Richard said, opening a folder. "We're here to discuss Riverside Commons and Oakwood Heights and Pine Valley Estates." The color drained from Karen's face. For just a moment, her carefully maintained facade cracked, showing raw panic underneath. Then the mask slipped back into place. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jenny began laying out documents on the coffee table. 3 years ago, Riverside Commons, you implemented mandatory health inspections for residents over 70. 7 seniors were forced to move when they couldn't meet your safety requirements. That was a legitimate community safety initiative. 2 years before that, Oakwood Heights, Richard continued, you attempted to make the HOA a mandatory healthcare proxy for elderly residents. When they refused, suddenly there were daily property violations. "You don't understand," Karen's voice rose. "These people needed help. They were putting themselves at risk, just like my grandmother. Like your mother? Margaret asked softly. The room fell silent. The one who got a restraining order against you. Karen sank into the nearest chair, her handbag falling forgotten to the floor. How did you? You had no right to. We had every right, Margaret interrupted but gently. Just as those seniors had every right to maintain their independence. Just as I have every right to live in my home without harassment. Mrs. Chen silently placed a glass of water in front of Karen, who stared at it as if she'd forgotten how drinking worked. It's all here, Jenny said, gesturing to the documents. Every community, every incident, every time you've moved on and started over. We have statements from your previous neighbors, documentation of your escalating tactics, even the psychological evaluation from your mother's case. You're lucky no one connected the dots before, Richard added. Some of these incidents taken together could constitute a pattern of criminal harassment. Karen's hands trembled as she reached for the water. You don't understand. My grandmother, she insisted she was fine living alone. Then one day we found her. She'd fallen. If we'd just forced her to accept help sooner. So you decided to force everyone to accept help, whether they needed it or not, Margaret finished. She moved to sit across from Karen. Your grandmother's. Tragedy doesn't give you the right to control other people's lives. I was trying to protect them, Karen burst out. Why can't anyone understand that? Because protection without respect isn't protection at all, Margaret replied. It's control, and it's hurt a lot of people, Karen, including you. Karen stared at the assembled evidence of her past actions, her carefully constructed worldview visibly crumbling. What are you going to do with all this? That, Margaret said, depends on you. We can take this public, expose everything to prevent you from continuing this pattern in other communities. Or you can choose to break the cycle yourself. Get help. Make amends to the people you've harmed. Learn to respect others' autonomy, even when you're worried about their choices. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Margaret's antique clock. Karen looked from face to face, finding no anger, only firm resolve. Finally, her shoulders sagged. I never meant to. I just wanted to prevent. She took a shaky breath. What exactly are you proposing? The community center buzzed with nervous energy as people filed in for what had been billed as an emergency neighborhood association meeting. But this wasn't just another HOA gathering. Representatives from 5 different communities sat in carefully arranged sections. Senior rights advocates lined one wall. A therapist specializing in family trauma sat quietly in the corner. Karen entered last, looking smaller somehow without her usual designer armor. She'd chosen a simple black dress instead of her trademark athleisure wear, and her hands clutched. A folder of papers so tightly her knuckles were white. Margaret watched from her seat at the front as Karen made her way to the podium. They'd spent hours negotiating this moment, crafting a path forward that would protect both the community and Karen's dignity. Now it all depended on whether Karen could follow through. Karen's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and started again. I've called this meeting to address my actions, both here and in other communities. Her eyes darted to Margaret, who gave her an encouraging nod. For the past 10 years, I've moved from neighborhood to neighborhood, implementing what I called safety measures for elderly residents. I convinced myself I was helping, protecting people, but I wasn't. I was controlling them, hurting them, and I need to take responsibility for that. A murmur ran through the crowd. In the Riverside Commons section, Mrs. Reynolds dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. It started with my grandmother, Karen continued, her voice stronger now. She fell while living alone, and I couldn't handle it. Instead of dealing with my grief and guilt, I tried to make sure it could never happen to anyone else. But you can't protect people by taking away their dignity. She began outlining specific incidents, acknowledging each community she'd harmed. The forced moves in Riverside Commons, the proxy battles in Oakwood Heights, the harassment campaigns. disguised as community welfare. To everyone I've hurt, I'm sorry. I'm working with a therapist now to understand why I did these things. And I'm working with legal representatives to make whatever amends I can. Margaret stood then, joining Karen at the podium. Mrs. Thompson has agreed to several concrete steps moving forward, she announced. First, she's resigning from all community leadership positions and agreeing not to seek such roles in the future without professional clearance. Richard stepped up next, outlining the legal framework they'd developed. A trust is being established to help seniors who were forced to move or incurred expenses due to these actions. Mrs. Thompson will be contributing significantly to this fund. The meeting continued as representatives from each community spoke, sharing their experiences and their hopes for healing. Karen sat through it all, accepting each testimony with visible remorse. Mrs. Chen's contribution was particularly moving. In my culture, we believe wisdom comes with age, but wisdom also means knowing when to admit mistakes and try to fix them. Today I see wisdom growing in unexpected places. Near the end, a surprise guest arrived. Karen's mother, Barbara Mitchell. She made her way slowly to the podium, using a cane that Karen had once tried to force her to use before she actually needed it. My daughter and I have a lot of healing to do, Barbara said, her voice firm despite her age. But recognizing the problem is the first step to solving it. Today, I'm proud to see her taking that step. The meeting concluded with the establishment of a community oversight committee designed to protect seniors' rights while providing genuine support for those who needed it. Karen would have no role in it, but her experience would help shape guidelines to prevent similar situations in the future. As people began to file out, many stopped to speak quietly with Karen. There were no easy forgivenesses, but there were small steps toward understanding. Mrs. Reynolds from Riverside Commons handed Karen her tissue box. For the next part of your journey, she said simply. Margaret watched it all from her seat, feeling the weight of the past months lifting. She caught Karen's eye and saw something new there, not the artificial concern of before, but a glimmer of genuine understanding. Sometimes, Margaret reflected, the greatest victory wasn't in defeating an opponent, but in helping them find a better path. As she gathered her things to leave, she smiled at the thought that her fight for independence had ultimately helped someone else find freedom from their own self-imposed chains. In the days following the community meeting, Maple Street underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud gradually lifted, replaced by a new awareness and respect for its elderly residents. Karen's house stood quiet, its perfect lawn still maintained, but no longer seeming like a reproach to others. Margaret noticed the changes during her morning gardening routine. Neighbors who had been hesitant to interact now stopped to chat, sharing their own stories about aging parents or their hopes for their own later years. The conversation had shifted from whispered concerns about elderly neighbors to open discussions about supporting independence with dignity. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Chen asked during their morning tea. "Karen's mother is helping her pack. She's moving back to her hometown for a while to work on their relationship and continue her therapy." Margaret watched through her window as Karen and Barbara worked together, carefully wrapping photos and memories in bubble wrap. There was an awkwardness to their interactions, but also a tentative warmth that hadn't been there before. The media attention had shifted too. Local news channels that had initially seized on the conflict now ran thoughtful pieces about senior rights and community support. Margaret's case became a reference point for discussions about aging with dignity. Senior advocacy groups reached out for her input on developing guidelines for community organizations. "You've started quite a movement," Richard commented during their weekly meeting. He showed her a stack of emails from other communities dealing with similar issues. "They're calling it the Margaret Principle, the right to age on your own terms." The neighborhood association underwent its own transformation. The new oversight committee, led by a diverse group of residents, including seniors and healthcare professionals, began developing genuinely supportive initiatives. Emergency contact systems were established with resident permission. Voluntary assistance programs were created, always with an emphasis on personal choice. One morning, Margaret found an envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a handwritten letter from Karen. "Dear Margaret, as I prepare to leave, I keep thinking about something you said, that protection without respect isn't protection at all. I'm beginning to understand how much damage I've done while convinced I was helping. My therapist says it will take time to unlearn these patterns, but I'm committed to doing the work. The trust fund is set up, and I've provided all the documentation needed to help those I've harmed. It doesn't feel like enough, but I understand now that making amends isn't about making myself feel better. It's about acknowledging the hurt I've caused and working to prevent it from happening again. My mother and I are talking more openly. Now, it's painful, but necessary. She told me about how powerless she felt when I tried to control her life, and for the first time, I really listened. Thank you for stopping me in a way that forced me to face myself. I don't expect forgiveness from anyone, but I hope that something good can come from all of this. Sincerely, Karen." Margaret carefully filed the letter away with her other documentation. Through her window, she could see Karen and Barbara loading the last boxes into a moving truck. Several neighbors had come to help, offering awkward but sincere goodbyes. Mrs. Chen appeared with a container of her famous lemon cookies. "For their drive," she explained, heading over to deliver them. Margaret watched as Karen accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, understanding the magnitude of such a simple gesture of kindness. Later that evening, as Margaret sat in her study reviewing the final documents from the trust establishment, she reflected on how a fight for personal independence had evolved into something much larger. The folders of evidence that had been weapons of defense were being transformed into teaching tools, helping other communities navigate the delicate balance between support and autonomy. A knock at her door revealed Mr. Peterson clutching a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" he asked excitedly. "They're using your case as an example in a new state bill about senior rights in community associations." Margaret smiled, thinking of all the elderly residents who would benefit from clearer protections. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating an opponent, but from transforming a conflict into an opportunity for positive change. As she watched Karen's moving truck finally pull away from Maple Street, Margaret felt no triumph, only hope. Hope that both Karen and the community had learned valuable lessons about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of helping others. 6 months after Karen's departure, Margaret hosted a different kind of neighborhood gathering in her Victorian home. Representatives from senior advocacy groups, community organizations, and local government sat in her carefully arranged living room, discussing the lasting impact of what had come to be known as the Maple Street case. "It's not just about senior rights anymore," explained Sarah Chen, who had expanded her blog into a full platform for aging-in-place resources. "It's about recognizing that support doesn't mean control, that aging doesn't mean losing autonomy." The changes had rippled far beyond their quiet neighborhood. The trust fund established by Karen had already helped 15 seniors return to independent living situations after being forced out of their homes by overzealous community regulations. More importantly, other neighborhoods were proactively reviewing their policies. "We've seen a 30% decrease in age-related discrimination complaints since implementing the Margaret Principle Guidelines," reported Lisa Martinez, the social worker who had once investigated Margaret's competency. "Communities are learning to ask, 'How can we support you?' instead of 'How can we control you?'" Margaret's documentation system had become a template for other seniors facing similar challenges. Her meticulous record-keeping and security measures were being taught in senior advocacy workshops as examples of proactive independence protection. The key was never about proving competence, Margaret explained to a journalist working on a feature story. It was about maintaining dignity. Everyone ages differently, and support should be as unique as the individual. Mrs. Chen, now heading the neighborhood's newly formed Senior Advisory Council, had developed a dignity-first approach to community assistance. Residents could request help without fear of losing control over their lives. Young families in the neighborhood volunteered for tasks that some seniors found challenging, while elderly residents shared their skills and experience in return. The transformation wasn't just institutional. Personal stories of healing emerged from the aftermath of the conflict. Karen, still in therapy, had begun speaking at senior care and conferences, sharing her journey from control to understanding. Her relationship with her mother continued to improve, built on a new foundation of respect and boundaries. Margaret taught us all something important, Mr. Peterson reflected during one community gathering. Standing up for yourself doesn't have to mean standing against others. Sometimes it means showing them a better way forward. The legal framework developed for Margaret's case was being studied by civil rights attorneys nationwide. Richard had received inquiries from law firms seeking to better protect senior clients from well-meaning but harmful interventions. The brilliance of Margaret's approach, Richard explained to a legal journal, was that it focused on education and prevention rather than punishment. She created a template for addressing these issues before they escalate into legal battles. Even the physical landscape of the neighborhood had changed. Gardens flourished with individual character rather than conforming to strict guidelines. Senior residents proudly maintained their properties in their own ways, while neighbors offered help that empowered rather than controlled. Margaret's own garden became a symbol of this new understanding. She still tended her roses daily, but now young families would stop by to learn from her expertise. She taught them about more than just gardening. She taught them about the grace of aging on one's own terms. The security cameras that had once documented harassment now captured moments of community connection. Neighbors checking on each other. During storms, spontaneous gatherings on front porches, children learning from elderly residents' experiences. The real lesson, Margaret told the assembled group in her living room, is that community safety isn't about control. It's about connection. When we respect each other's dignity, we build something stronger than any set of rules could enforce. As the meeting concluded, Margaret walked her guests out into the crisp evening air. Her Victorian home stood as it always had, a testament to independence and dignity. But now it represented something more, a landmark in the ongoing conversation about aging with autonomy. The streetlights came on as the last guests departed, casting warm pools of light on the sidewalk. Margaret stood on her porch, remembering the tension that had once filled these evenings. Now, there was only the peaceful sound of neighbors living their lives, each in their own way, supported but not controlled by the community around them. She smiled, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning battles, but from transforming them into opportunities for understanding. The lessons of Maple Street would continue to ripple outward, helping others find their own path to aging with dignity and grace. 1 year to the day after the police cars had gathered outside her Victorian home, Margaret sat in her garden, enjoying the early morning sunshine. Her roses were in full bloom, their fragrance mingling with the aroma of fresh coffee from her favorite china cup. A card had arrived that morning from Karen, containing a photograph of her and her mother working together in a community garden, a new hobby they'd taken up as part of their healing process. The note inside was simple: learning to let things grow in their own way. Thank you for teaching me that. Mrs. Chen appeared at the garden gate, carrying a fresh batch of lemon cookies. Did you see the news? 3 more communities have adopted the Margaret Principle Guidelines. They're calling you a quiet revolutionary. Margaret chuckled, pouring a second cup of coffee for her friend. There's nothing revolutionary about respecting dignity. We just had to remind people that wisdom doesn't come with an expiration date. As they sat together in the peaceful garden, watching young families and elderly residents going about their morning routines on Maple Street, Margaret reflected on how the fight to maintain her own independence had helped others find theirs. Sometimes the smallest stands could create the largest ripples. "You know," Mrs. Chen said thoughtfully, "in all the excitement, I don't think anyone ever asked you. Why didn't you just give Karen your spare key that first day? It might have been easier." Margaret smiled, sipping her coffee. "My dear, sometimes the hardest path is the right one. Besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "after 90 years, I've learned that the best way to keep standing is to know what you're standing for."